Welcome to the course, International Studies in Vernacular Architecture. Today, we are going to talk about tradition and transmission. From the discussion on man and his relation with the environment, we have to discuss about 4 stages of man's changing attitude towards his environment. So that is where Gutkind brings about 4 different stages of relationship. How an I-thou relationship takes place into I-it relationship. In stage 1, which is actually characterized with fear. In our earlier class also we did discuss about how the foragers society, how they have transformed into agricultural societies. And that has given more secured perceptions towards their belonging. So whether it is that day or today, the concept remains the same. Humans with his digging stick, he was digging the hills or any natural resources to make his dwelling, to create his agricultural products or to create which is needed for his survival. Today, we are cutting down the hills with proclines or any kind of excavators. So that day it was with a stick, today it was doing with the machines. So the very first stage is his survival process, and he has to create his territorial belonging that is actually characterized with a fear. In the olden days, he was making his dwellings and he was making boundaries so that he can protect from the enemy tribes or any wild animals. The very first stage what we talked about, the I-thou relationship, is how the man has integrated the nature in his setting. So if you look at some of these African tribes, so how their dwellings and how their settlements are coherent with the natural settings. Similarly, in the Philippines, the rice farming lands, the terrace gardens, the terrace farms, all these are depicting the how man has negotiated with nature and then how he tried to adapt along with the nature. But whereas in the stage 2, we talk about the stage of self-confidence. So he started realizing that yes, I can survive, I can tame the nature, I can domesticate animals. And so in that way, he started building a representation for himself. So that is where, for example, you talk about the pyramids, the tombs which he has made, the temples which he has made. So these are all an examples of showcasing his self-confidence. Similarly, the stage 3, which talks about the aggression and conquest. So the reproduction capacities have improved, their storage capacities have improved. So in that way, the population demographics have drastically changed. In that whole process of improving their capabilities in taming the nature, so that is where we call it the stages of aggression and conquest. Today, we are at this stage. We are cutting down the hills, we are taking out the stones, we are building settlements, so this is where we are in this stage. But the stage 4, which he talks about, the future age of responsibility and unification. So in fact, even till today, we are talking about how can we adapt to the climate change. Yes, how can we talk about the principles of the sustainability? How can we meet our present needs at the same time how our future generations can also sustain? How we can rely on alternative hydro energy? How we can rely on the solar energy? How can we not disturb the nature much? So there is a consciousness parallelly developing. So this is where we talk about the future age of responsibility and how we actually unify in that process. When we talk about this aggression, when we talk about the self-confidence, and this is the result of these traditions, the power, the authority has been showcased in the evolution of these settlements, So till 1960s, much of the literature have talked only on the monumentality of these traditions, but not much has been talked about the common man's traditions, the folk traditions. So where we take about the dwellings in Venice or in the peasants in the Mediterranean cultures, peasants' dwellings. So not much of the work has been done on this part of the dwellings. When we talk about the context of landscape architecture, the landscape itself, it is considered as both dynamic and it is ever changing. and whereas architecture is always treated as static and finite. So when we talk about traditions, these aesthetical qualities, they are not just specially created for each house, but whatever the traditional dwellings, so these are a result of collaboration of many people, including the maker and the users and the artifacts, and they are being transmitted down from one generation to another generation. So tradition is nothing but a packets of information that has been passed on from one generation to the another generation. So tradition, if I have to summarize it, honored by everyone, and it is a collective assent, and it acts as a discipline in a particular group. So in my society, what I learned from my ancestors is my language, my eating habits, my taste, my decorative skills. So all these things have been transmitted from my ancestors to my parents, and now I am passing on to my children. The way we celebrate our festivals, the way we eat food on banana leaf, for during the occasions. So all these are the transmissions which we got to know from our ancestors. And in a particular society, it is collectively honored by everyone. They have a mutual respect to each other. And when we talk about these folk traditions, the common man's traditions, it is a direct and unself-conscious translation into a physical form of culture based on its needs and values, as well as the desires, dreams, and passions of the people. So that is where it is referred as the ideal environment of a people, expressed in the buildings and the settlements, where there is no role of a professional designer or an artist or an architect. So this is where the very preliminary understanding of Bernard Rudowski is in the modern exhibitions, his photographic exhibition, where he actually documents a variety of folk architecture, and he refers to as non-pedigreed architecture. And later on, Amos Rappaport, in his seminal work of House, Form and Culture, he talks about how these folk traditions are classified in a primitive, pre-industrial vernacular, high style, and modern vernacular. So let's talk about a primitive. What is primitive? It refers to a model with a very few variations, which is produced by the societies by themselves. It is built by all. Whether the second process is there's a limited number of building types, but more individual variation of these models. So here it was a tribal society. If you go to any of these tribal societies in Africa or any other places, like you see many of their houses reflect in a similar form, similar model, because whether it is my house or your house, everyone comes together and build their house. It's everyone's business. So whereas here, different specializations have been transformed. A person who was working with the mud became a potter. A person who was working with the wood, he became a carpenter. So in that way, a weaver needs a different space, a carpenter needs a different space, a potter needs a different space. So that's how the specializations have gradually evolved, and these are all built by the tradesmen. And whereas in the high style and the modern vernacular, this is where many specialized building typologies have evolved, and each building is an original creation. And this is designed and built by a team of specialists. So this is how we talked about the traditions, but what happens without the tradition? There can be no longer a reliance on the accepted norms, and that is where the beginning of the institutionalization. So here we are talking about the mutual respect, how as a collective assent, how we honor together a particular norm or a practice. But when we don't trust each other, when we don't follow each other, and that is where a set of codes, a set of norms, rules, regulations will come into the practice. How to do and how not to do. This is where the institutionalized process comes into the picture, including our social institutions such as marriage. Marriage is a social institution. Whether it is a patrilineal society, whether it is a matrilineal society, how the properties has to be inherited. So all these are the processes as a result of living practices, and how when the traditions are no longer able to sustain, and that is where it has given result to the institutionalization process. And that's the background of the traditional understanding on these traditions. But then how are these traditional knowledge get transferred? So today we are going to talk about the person-to-person transfer and how these transmissions are relevant in the architecture and the vernacular architecture mainly, and how today what kind of situations they are facing on. So I'm going to discuss about few tribal habitats and also few communities across the world and how their vernacular processes, how they used to adapt with these situations and what are they now, what are the reasons behind these, whether it is a decorative practice, whether it is a house construction process, or how time have brought many changes into their habitats. So in the primitive societies, there is always a diffuse of knowledge of everything by all, and every aspect of tribal life is everybody's business. There is no technical vocabulary because there is a little specialization beyond age and sex. In many of the African tribes, the women, men, children, everyone knows everything there. So they come together and they build these houses, whether it is mud houses or any kind of grass houses made out of grass. So they all come together. They know each and every one of the community knows their skills. So in fact, in the Polynesian tribes, where they call it as a Salmon Falais constructions, so that is where all these communities, they come together and they build these falaise. And in Roxana Watson's work on Solang Taroja tribes in Indonesia, where you can see that the whole male members of the community, they come together, including the child, the youngsters, they're all coming together to build a particular house and making it, they erect it and move to that place. In a Papua New Guinean context, where you can see that, that all these dwellings are more or less, they have a similar form, built with the similar materials, similar skills, but they also have these kind of central public spaces where there are ceremonial grounds, where they celebrate their festivals, where the community comes together, where they sacrifice the pigs and distribute along with the community. And these are the called ceremonial buildings, which are also the cultural artifacts, where this is called Yam Houses. And these Yam Houses are made with the finest wood, and they give the intricate decorative look, and so that they reflect the pride of that particular community. Yam houses are nothing but they store their food products. There's a root called yam, so that is how they store these roots for the future days. So the more storage of food you have, the richer it, they try to portray it. So because the storage of food is an important factor in the tribal society, because it can sustain the future generations. So in fact, if the food is scarce, obviously it is depicted gradually in their appearance of these ceremonial buildings and the maintenance of these ceremonial buildings. So it showcases that how rich is the society is all. In a similar way, they have developed different variations of housing for the elderly, how the elder's house could be of a little low height, and whereas they have these family houses and the ceremonial buildings. So they brought this distinction and how the ceremonial buildings, the religious buildings have to look like, and how the elderly houses have to look like. So they started building a distinction of this process. In the African context, we talk about the Hausa traditional architecture, where these tribes, they're all built by the fathers and the sons. The male plays an important role. And here you can see that, the most important, the zoning of their house from the Salamilik area to Haremlik area. So where you have this public area and the semi-private area and the private area, most of the time the women spend their time over these places, because that is where it's a very conservative society, and the father have taught how to build these houses to his son, and it has been transferred from there to his sons and his sons further. So if you look at this, so you have the typical layout of the Hausa traditional architecture is you have these open courtyards, and you have these lavatories on towards the outside, or maybe for the various hygienic regions. And you have the master bedroom and the living room and the wife's bedroom, and in that way there's clear segregation of the transition from the public areas to the semi-private areas and the private areas, because the kids can play in these courtyards with a sense of safety. And similarly, making a roof is also an important aspect of this Hausa traditional architecture and their decorations, how these pinnacles are very important to represent in their particular society. And the Hausa architecture depicts various decorations in the house facades, and they also use the bright colors which are actually native in those clay contents, and they try to extract those and they apply that as motifs or the mural decorations, and that is how their pinnacles are also highlighted on that basis. So these motifs, they can be categorized into 4 classes. Like the first is by the modeling a fresh mud plaster manually into an arabesque feature. And the second by cutting ornament into a wet cement or a mud plaster. The third by plastering the wall with makuba. Fourth by painting on a plain white wall. So this is how the process, and all these symbolic decorative elements is an artistic aspect, and they do it with the locally available clays and the colors. So it also they use these bright colors, and they have to also maintain these aspects. The maintenance is also an important aspect. And today what we are seeing is initially these traditional houses are completely done with the mud, and now the generations have changed, and now all these traditional houses are undergoing a huge transformations with the newer construction techniques, newer construction, brick and concrete, have come into their places, and that's how they are struggling hard to sustain also. On a similar note, in the South African tribes, the Nebele house, where women plays an important role. So here the women, they decorate these exteriors of these houses after finishing their beading work, and they actually decorate with the locally available colors. But here they do. There is a political representation, because many of these tribal lands, they were actually once upon a time they were occupied by the Boers, the Dutch colonists, and they used to do these as an expression for both the personal accomplishment and the community resistance to the domination of Boers. And so these people are not trained by any school or any art training, but they are all transmitted from the mother have taught to the daughter, and that's how the daughter, when she grew up, she have taught to her daughters. So this is how they have transmitted these knowledge. And if you look at this, how as a part of a resistance process, they try to portray that in a very innocent actions, as a combination of a black, green and yellow of the African National Congress. So the political, which is the political arm of the black resistance to the apartheid. And so in this process, the imitation with these colorful decorations and the motifs has a latent form of expression of their resistance. The resistance was in a latent form, which is in a secret, but it is a transparent process. And not only that, when do they do this? When it is associated to many puberty seclusion rites and the men initiation rites, when a group of men, when they achieve at the 18 to 22, so that is where they referred as Vela. And so the woman paints, decorates their exterior walls as a significance aspect, so during these occasions for every 4 years or so, which is also a kind of maintenance processes of their dwellings. So initially they were all made with the circular shapes, and later on they were transforming into a rectangular shapes. And today many of these houses, their materials have been transformed into the tin sheets, and instead of grass they have using newer materials. And in this whole process, the individuality is shown as her style of decoration. So here the woman plays an important role. On a similar note, we talk about the Bhutanese culture in the work of Regina Mapav Lim. And here the 4 generations of women come together when they are building the house. When we talk about the Hausa traditional architecture, it is not just a matter of only the ownership, because in their culture there is no one who is owning a particular land which is not owned by himself or herself. It is basically a kind of a community coherence which is organized by their particular society's head. So even someone who is walking by, they can just call him to be part of the house construction process. So that is how the community has been playing an important role, engaging each and everyone in the house building process. So similarly in the Bhutan, where the woman comes together, all the grandmother and the daughter, then mothers, the daughters and the granddaughters, they come together and they have these ceremonial occasions where they come together and they ram the earth, they mix the soil with the amount of clay, and then they completely ram it, and they have these ceremonial celebrations. So all these ceremonial celebrations mark an event of bringing people together, bringing different generations together, and that is how the knowledge is transferred. So in that way, Gale talks about the places are doubly constructed, and most are built or in some way physically carved out. They are interpreted, they are narrated, they are perceived, and they are also felt, they are understood, and they are imagined. So in the context of South Indian context, in the Dravidian context, so let me bring you an example of Toda Tribes, which is in the Nilgiris bioreserve. And these tribes, they are actually located in the biosphere reserves, Nilgiri biosphere reserves, and there are a few tribes, Todas, Kotas, and Kurumbas. There are a few tribes which are settled in these particular areas, and you can see their traditional hut. They're basically a half barrel shaped, and which is covered with the grass, and the front part which has these granite stones and which has a very small entry which is just only a person can crawl into it. That's how they have these. And here these Toda tribes, they are basically they believe that they have been the first god has given birth to buffalo, and then they given to the Toda man and the woman. So that is how for them the buffalo is a very sacred animal, and then that is how they become a part of this the dairy industry. The dairy culture is very important for this particular tribe. And if you look at some of these photographs, they wear these black and red and white, so have their simple dhoti or a simple one-piece cloth which they wore it. And whether the men and the women, they have a very rich symbolic aspects of this red and black and white combination. And even in the temples, this is one of the very old temples. In 1909, someone have taken this photograph, Edgar Thurston. And even these temples, they are basically meant for men. The women are not allowed to nearby places, because in that way, the role of men and the role of women was very different. And also, their green festivals, where any kind of ceremonial rituals or funerals, anything that they used to organize as a group, and especially how they consider this pastoral life as a part of their sanctity, and this is how these tribes used to survive. And now these tribes have actually undergoing many different changes, because on one side the deforestation and on the afforestation process, and many of them were encroached by newcomers on this particular region, and it has gradually brought some impacts on their architecture as well. And these are basically vegetarians, because they believe in this pastoral life, and is a vegetarian community. And today, their dwelling models, though they are imitating these Toda tribes and the Toda architecture, which the group of houses is referred as the mums, and these dwellings are referred as the doggles. And this is how the newer forms are imitating in the same form, but then they have been modified with the newer materials. So they have this polyandrial system where earlier the women used to marry the brothers within their family, So, but now today that has been abandoned, and a new set of institutional systems have been adapted by these communities. So there is a small film I would like to show, which has been documented by the Ministry of Tribal Affairs. So I would like you to watch this film, and it actually explains the kind of transformation that these tribes are undergoing, and that would help you to relate what you learn from the African context, what you learn from the Bhutanese context, and what you learn from these South Asian context, how the traditions have been transmitted from one generation to another generation, whether in the form of art, in the form of a decoration, aesthetics, a skill, and their livelihoods, so all this process, and today how they are struggling to be part of it. So this would be important learning in this process.
The Nilgiri Hills in southern India, known for their diverse flora and fauna and picturesque vistas. A popular retreat for people from the surrounding plains and a backdrop for many a Tamil movie. Lesser known, however, is the diversity of the indigenous people of the Nilgiris. The Irulas, the Badagas, and the Kurubas are only a few of the tribal groups that have made their home in these hills. Of all the tribal groups, however, the best known are the pastoralists, the Toda. Living at altitudes of 2000 to 2500 meters on the western side of the Nilgiri plateau, the Toda have caught the eye of many an anthropologist. This is probably because of the regal walk of the Toda men as they make their way over the pastures tending their buffaloes. The Toda stand out by the clothes they wear, long flowing white cloaks embroidered with coloured bars thrown over the shoulder with a white waistcloth. Nowadays, pants and shirts or saris and blouses are worn under these cloaks. These cloaks have led to speculation about their origin, and some anthropologists believe that they came from ancient Sumer. Physically too, they are distinctive, tall, slim, with sharp facial features and excessive body hair. Traditionally, the Toda men wore their beards long, as can be seen even today among the older generation. Toda women, on the other hand, stand out by their unique hairstyle, long ringlets that hang on both sides of the face. Up to 20 years ago, it was mandatory for the women to be tattooed after attaining puberty. The chest, back, hands and feet were covered with a pattern of rings and dots. Tattooing would be done by making a paste of soot and breast milk, followed by a drawing with a special thorn. Young women these days rarely get themselves so extensively tattooed. A small symbolic tattoo is, however, still prevalent. The Toda live in small villages scattered over the slopes of the Nilgiris. A typical village consists of only 3 or 4 houses. At first sight, a Toda village looks like any other. A closer look and one will find a temple hut set apart from the houses. Made from local materials, these huts are unique in design. They are barrel vaulted with half a barrel shaped roof and side walls that project some distance beyond the front and rear walls. The rounded part of the roof is made of rattan, supported by cross pieces of bamboo or hardwood, while grass is used as thatching. Wooden planks sunk vertically into the ground form the front and rear walls of these huts. The use of stone slabs instead of the planks is a modern innovation. Earlier, even the houses were made in this fashion. Nowadays, due to a shortage of grass, only the temples are made in the traditional way. There is a small opening in the front of the house where one has to bend low to enter. Once inside, one is confronted by the compactness of the hut. A bed on the left where the whole family sleeps together. On the right, the stove is built at ground level. Above the stove, the firewood is stored in a way that the heat from the stove keeps it dry. On an opposite wall to the entrance are the shelves that hold the utensils. It is common to see pictures of Hindu gods adorning the walls. The interiors of the Toda houses have remained much the same over the years, even if the exteriors have changed. The Toda are pastoralists and herders of the Nilgiris, and their lives have revolved around the tending of buffaloes. Families from different tribal communities were linked to one another through hereditary links passed down over generations. In this system, the Toda provided the dairy products in exchange for grains from the Badagas, utensils and craftware from the Kotas, and forest produce from the Kuruba. In earlier days, economic exchange had ritual and social dimensions and took place according to established relationships rather than randomly in a marketplace. Apart from the exchange of materials, the tribes also performed different ritual and ceremonial duties for one another. Toda buffaloes are a semi-wild species well adapted to the Nilgiri environment. They have long, curved, flat horns with rings marking their age and a thick growth of light brown hair. The Toda distinguish between 2 kinds of buffalo, sacred and ordinary. The ordinary ones are tended by the boys and men of the village, while the sacred ones are tended only by dairymen priests. The Toda believe in a pantheon of gods and goddesses who are sometimes mentioned in formal prayers, and their activities and attributes are recorded in legend. These Toda divinities are called by the generic name Tovit, meaning gods of the mountains, as most of them are believed to reside on particular Nilgiri peaks. Of all the gods and goddesses, the goddess Tekarshi and her younger brother On are the most important. On is believed to have created the Toda and their buffaloes, while Tekarshi is believed to be the divine ruler of the world who instituted the customs of the Toda. She is also responsible for the division of the Toda into subcastes and clans. The dairy huts and the associated pens, calf sheds, pasturage and water supply are the most immediate divine presence in everyday life. In other words, the dairies are the temples and the dairymen the priests. The sanctity of the dairy buildings is of utmost importance, and they fall into different classes according to the degree of sanctity of the associated buffalo. The dairymen priests undergo elaborate ceremonies which vary in complexity. They undergo a series of initiation ceremonies and must observe strict regulations during their tenure. Among the Toda, these divine spaces are not accessible to women, and the temples can only be entered by the dairymen priests. The inner room of the dairy is the Sanctum Sanctorum. The sacred dairy equipment is kept here, and it is here that the dairyman performs his most important duty, which is the churning of milk into buttermilk and butter. Earlier a daily practice, but these days, due to the small population of the Toda, this happens only once a year. Particular villages are marked by the impressive structure of the conical temple. In the hierarchy of dairies and their associated buffalo, these dairies are at the top. A typical day starts at dawn. The men salute the rising sun and release the buffaloes from their pen to be milked. Most of the rites of passage in Toda life involve buffaloes or dairies or both. This is true even today, when the economic role of the buffalo is decreasing. The child is recognized as a social being between the ages of 1 to 3 months during the ritual ceremony of uncovering its face. During this ceremony, the child is also given a name. Marriages are initiated during childhood but completed at maturity. It is common for a Toda child of a few months to be married, as it is a ritual requirement for every Toda to be married. These alliances are flexible and can be changed when the children attain maturity. While the men go to sell the milk in the market, the women churn the milk that has been drawn the previous day and left to coagulate. In earlier times, with the prevalence of female infanticide, it was common to see Toda families that were polyandrous. A man's wife was automatically the wife to all his brothers. The pots and tools used for churning are specially designed and their sanctity is well guarded. After churning, the butter is extracted and the rest of the meal is set on the fire to cook. Traditionally, the Toda are vegetarians, and a typical Toda meal consists of rice with butter and a little chutney made from tomatoes and chilies. A close observation suggests that ritual has been used as a means to protect the purity of the sacred dairies. Thus, marriage and physical maturity are less ritualized as compared to birth and death, which are considered polluting events throughout India. Among all of life's crises, it is death that generates the greatest profusion of ritual among the Toda. Every major social division, patriclan and matriclan, has a role to play at the funeral. On the morning of the funeral, Toda men and women from all over the hills begin to assemble at the dead person's hamlet. A cot is made ready. It is decorated with ornaments, pictures, and laden with provisions and belongings of the deceased. According to Toda belief, the deceased go and join their ancestors in an afterworld called Amunor. While the men perform a ritual dance, a group of Irulas play popular tunes, as tradition does not allow the Toda to play musical instruments. The body is carried to the cot and tied down with tassels by men belonging to the opposite subcaste to that of the deceased. The body is then carried by the same men to the place of the funeral, where a wooden pyre has been made ready with wood from the nearest shola forest. The women follow a little distance behind the men. With a great show of grief, the living say their last goodbyes to the deceased. As seen here, the son-in-law of the dead woman offers a multicolored cloth. He touches the cloth to his forehead and then passes it on to his wife. An important rite, it stands for the respect a man must show to the clan of his wife. The daughters-in-law of the deceased then start to light the pyre with the help of a cloth soaked in ghee. Once the fire is lit, men from the opposite subcaste pass the cot 3 times over the fire. This ritual started after a man presumed dead was revived by the warmth of the flames in the long-distant past. Till 2 decades ago, buffaloes were sacrificed at the time of death. The number and sanctity of the sacrificed buffaloes would vary according to the status of the deceased. Reformers within Toda society have ensured that this practice be stopped. The last 20 years have seen significant changes in the lifestyle of the Toda. The bazaar at Uti has great economic and social bearing and has led to many innovations spreading to Toda hamlets. With education and the switch to an urban lifestyle, they tend to lose their distinct identity. Many a Toda youth today looks at the traditional way of life as undesirable and will do their best to blend in with the crowd. Similarly, it has become difficult to separate Toda gods and goddesses from the pantheon of mainstream Hinduism. The Mariamman Temple, situated near the Uti Bazaar, is now a major ritual center for the Toda. And as they hear of the efficacy of Hindu deities, they make pilgrimages to Hindu places of worship and import the images of Hindu gods into their homes. The Toda have benefited from a number of government schemes. New concrete houses made in the traditional shape were introduced in the 1960s. Despite improvements like doors, windows and chimneys, these designs were unsuccessful as they were found to be too cold. The most significant government policy has been the granting of land rights in an attempt to encourage the Toda to switch to farming. Unfortunately, this well-intentioned policy has had a negative effect. Not being used to agriculture, very few Toda have taken to farming. Instead, they lease out their land to other farmers. Sadly today, a major part of this income goes towards liquor, and alcoholism is a big problem, particularly among Toda men. Another factor that has impacted the life of the Toda is the new plantation policy of the government. Due to their obvious monetary advantages, pine and eucalyptus are being planted in place of the traditional shola forest and pastures. The few pastures that do remain are being polluted by industrial waste. So even those Toda who want to keep their buffalo are finding it increasingly difficult to do so. The government also tried to introduce high milk yielding varieties of buffalo. Unfortunately, these had to be stall fed and were therefore unsuited to the Toda lifestyle. The new generation of reformers within Toda society face a tough challenge to preserve this dwindling community. Only 1,500 Toda are surviving today, spread over 600 small villages, and their numbers are fast decreasing. New concepts like embroidery groups for women and milk cooperatives are establishing themselves as new sources of livelihood that make use of their traditional skills. In spite of these efforts, the bottom line is that pastoralism as a way of life for the Toda is on the decline, and with that, their unique identity as a tribe is bound to be lost.
Thank you very much.